All right, everyone. Today we are starting our new unit on history and the approaches of psychology. This is our first video notes session, so I will go over some instructions for you here. So we're in the process of flipping our classroom, and what that means is that at least 3 times a week, if not every single day, you're gonna go home. You'll pull out your note sheet that I would have given you before you left class, and you will watch this video and fill out the notes. All you're doing is filling out the blanks and writing down any definitions, and then finishing and then completing the consolidation activity at the end. Now, this shouldn't take more than 30 minutes. I try to keep the video to less than 15 minutes so that you have time to pause it, write down anything you need to write, start it back, and then of course finish the consolidation activity at the end. Now, the reason we are doing this is because I have acknowledged that I spend way too much time talking during class just to give you notes that you never even have time to process. And how are we supposed to do well on the test if you don't have time to process? So I'm going to utilize the classroom time to engage us as a class into some deep processing activities. Because remember that the deeper we process, the less surface level and more internal, and when we actually think about the meaning and how it's connected to all the other terms in psychology, the more likely we are to remember whenever we're given a test. All right, so I'm going to stop talking about why we're doing this, and now we're going to jump right into it. All right, so as you're watching the video, you need to make sure you have your note sheet out. You need to make sure you have some writing utensil, pen or pencil, doesn't matter, up to you. Basically, you're just the notes are going to be exactly word for word what's on your notes. You're just copying down the blanks, and then at the end of the video, you're going to engage in the consolidation activity, which should be explained at the bottom of your notes page. All right, so let's get started. Today we are talking about the birth of psychology, how this all came about. And I'm going to be looking over here to the right sometimes because I'm still new to this, and I need to follow my notes sometimes. All right, let's go. And I will say, yes, this is awkward that I'm just sitting in my room and just talking to a computer and myself. It is kind of weird, but I think it's worth it. Just imagine me sitting there with you right now. All right, so the questions psychology seeks to answer can be traced back throughout human history and across all cultures. All early thinkers, anybody with a mind that was thinking at some point, asked themselves, why am I here? How does my mind work? How does my body relate to my mind? Buddha questioned how sensations and perceptions combine to form ideas. So we see a connection to religion there. Confucius, an early philosopher, early Chinese philosopher, understood the power of ideas and a disciplined mind. But a lot of times in psychology, we trace the origins of these questions or of these ideas and principles and approaches to the ancient Greeks. And the reason we trace it back to the ancient Greeks is because they have a very well recorded history of these kinds of discussions. And we'll talk about them. So the ancient Greeks, back in 470 BC, so that's 470 years before Jesus was born, if you're a Christian and you believe in that. So way back then, Socrates and Plato having a conversation, and they were arguing over what the mind is and how it relates to the body. And ultimately, they concluded that the body and the mind were separable, that they're these separate entities. The mind is this immaterial, floating, invisible thing, whereas the body is this physical, tangible thing. You can feel it, you can touch it, you can smell it sometimes, And so they ultimately came to the conclusion that if the body were to die, that the mind would continue on. And you gotta understand that this is an early idea of what the mind is. And in their heads or in their ideas, they thought that the mind was this spirit that kind of, was in this body, but could be something different. All right, so then Aristotle believed that we derive our knowledge from observation. He said that without a body to experience the world, the mind would not exist. So let's think about that. If we derive our body from if we derive our knowledge from observation, the observations of what? Of the real world? Well, how could you experience the real world without real eyes? Without real ears, without a tongue, without like sensations in your fingers? So you need your body to experience the world, is what Aristotle is saying. All right. Now we're going to fast forward about 2,000 years to the 1600s to the 1700s. This is the early stages of scientific discovery, especially in Europe. These were when the processes of science, such as like dissecting, using a microscope, things like that, were being developed. And so we call this the early scientific psychology stage. This is before psychology has really come together as a collective body of research, and is more of like attached to like other parts of research, especially biology. Okay, so we start with Rene Descartes, and he had this idea that we should research on how, like, he believed that the mind was separate from the body as well, just like Plato. However, that brings up the question: how does the mind interact with the body if they're separate? How do they interact? Where do they make contact? And he ultimately came up with this idea that the brain was the seat of the human spirit, and when he says human spirit, it means the mind. So Descartes dissected animals and concluded that the fluid in the brain's cavities contained animal spirits. These spirits flowed through the brain in what we call nerves. At the time he thought they were hollow, and it's just like a tube, and the spirit would just like flow through there, and then all of a sudden it would touch your toe, and then you'd flex your little toe, right? Or you'd flex your little finger. Now this is before he knew of neurons, so it's surprising that he was actually kind of accurate, even though the idea of animal spirits doesn't exist. But yeah, these spirits would flow through the nerves, and they would provoke movement. Memories formed as experiences opened the pores in the brain into which the animal spirits flowed. Okay, so then we move on to Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was one of the early founders of modern science, and he was fascinated by the human mind and the way that it made errors. He knew that the mind and our human nature just has a desire to make sense of the world, and we perceive patterns even in a course of random events. He said that human understanding, from its peculiar nature, easily supposes a great degree of order, that everything makes sense, even if nothing makes sense. All right. Now we move on to John Locke. John Locke believed that we are born a blank slate, that our mind is completely empty, and that everything we know comes from something from the outside world, whether it's your parents talking to you, whether it's you throwing a rock in the air and falling on the ground and you realize that gravity exists. John Locke introduced that idea that we learn everything from experience. And this leads to the idea of empiricism. And this is your first vocabulary word, so go ahead and take time to write the word empiricism. In the meantime, pause this video right here. All right, so let's get started with the next slide. All right, so now we're moving on into the actual science of psychology. And that all started with Wilhelm Wundt in 1879. Notice that you pronounce German W's as V's. So Wilhelm Wundt was considered the father of modern psychology. And he created a reaction time experiment. They created this machine that measured the time lag between people hearing a ball hit a platform and then pressing a little key. So they basically asked these participants to press this button when they heard the sound of the ball drop. They were either asked in one of two ways. A, they said, press the button when you hear the sound. Or they said, press the button when you're consciously aware of the sound. Interestingly enough, subjects were 0.1 seconds slower when they were given prompt B, when they're asked to be consciously aware. And now what this showed to Wilhelm is that one, consciously hearing something and hearing something are two different things. They're different. And that for some reason, being conscious of something is like an extra thing that's added on. So it's a mental process. So you have one mental process that says like, I'm going to hear something. You have another mental process that's bringing that into consciousness. So obviously, if you only hear something, it'll be faster than hearing something and bringing it into consciousness. So he called these atoms of the mind that are the smallest element of a mental process. All right. Now, Edward Titchener was one of Wilhelm Wundt's students at, was it Leipzig? That's the name of the university they worked at. And Edward Titchener founded this idea called structuralism. So I'll go ahead and let you write down the definition for structuralism. All right, pause it here. All right, so introspection. So Edward Titchener used this idea of introspection, and he asked participants to look inside themselves, look inside their minds, and find the structures, the things that make up the mind. And what he believed these structures to be were the sensations, the feelings, the images, and the connections. So, for example, he would ask participants to like look at this rose, and they would tell them, like, all right, what are you sensing? Well, they would say, oh, I'm sensing like the petals are smooth, the scent, the aroma is sweet, it makes me feel happy. I notice that it's insanely red, parts of it are deteriorating, and this reminds me of my, I don't know, my first date or something, right? And so they're talking about the sensations, feelings, images, and connections within people's minds. And these were what he was calling the structures, right? However, there's one problem with this idea, and it's that people are extremely inconsistent. What I see when I look at a rose might be different from what somebody else sees, And so recording all these introspections doesn't really tell us about how the mind works. It just tells us about how that one person's mind works. So unreliable and inconsistent means not scientific. You can't do something scientific with something that's unreliable. Now we come to William James. So William James was a functionalist. He was inspired by the evolutionist Charles Darwin. Now what that means is, so if you don't know who Charles Darwin is, Charles Darwin was the scientist who founded the idea of evolution. And that meant that organisms either survived or they didn't, based on their physical traits and their behaviors. And whichever animals with the physical traits and behaviors that were more advantageous in that environment were the ones that survived and got to pass on their offspring, and then their offspring would have the same behaviors and functional traits that they did. So William James believed that the mind works in a similar way. All the things that our mind does has a purpose and has a use, and it helps us survive. It helps us function in this society. So I'm gonna let you write down the definition for functionalism now. Oh. Right. So pause the video here. I messed up here, hold on. Okay. I'm sorry. Just wait a second. Okay, so that was functionalism. Still getting used to this. Right. And one of his students, one of James's students, Mary Calkins. Now, Mary Calkins has an interesting story. I don't want to get it wrong, so I'm going to bring it up here actually. All right. So, all right. So, William James worked at Harvard, and he had this student named Mary Calkins. Now, when Mary entered William James's class, this is before women had the right to vote. This is before women were supposed to be in higher education, let alone get a PhD. So when Mary Calkins entered the class, all of the other men in the class, which was all the rest of the students, they literally walked out. They left the class. They didn't want any part of it. However, James was a feminist, and he decided to tutor Mary Calkins on his own, and eventually ended up getting a higher score than all of her male counterparts in the qualification exams. Now, even though she was apparently way better than all of the other male students, Harvard never actually granted her her PhD. Despite all this, Mary Calkins went on to have a successful career in research and psychology, and she became the first female American Psychological Association president in 1905. Later on, Margaret Floyd Washburn became the actual first psychology PhD, rather than Mary Calkins. Now, William James' idea that we should focus more on the functions of the mind led to the field of experimental psychology. So I'll let you write that definition down. So pause the video there. All right. And the experimental psychology is the idea that we should only learn about the mind and its functions by creating experiments. We have to create experiments in order to test how the mind responds to a certain stimulus, how it functions. Okay. Now let's talk about Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is probably one of the most popular psychologists of all time. He's the creator of the psychodynamic approach or psychoanalysis, and he's famous for like this couch situation. He would be sitting over here on the couch, and his subject would be lying on this more horizontal couch, and they would just talk. They just talk through whatever the person was going through. And what Sigmund Freud found was that all of our human mental impulses and behaviors could be traced back to early childhood experiences or innate sexual desires. Now, his theories were extremely controversial. One, because none of it was founded on actual evidence. Sigmund Freud created his theory based on his own dreams. So he used a lot of dream analysis to come up with a general theory for how all human mental processes work. And so he created the theory first, then he performed research that ended up supporting it. However, that seems to be backwards. And we can talk about more about that when we get into social psychology in a later unit. I think it's unit 8. All right, next approach is behaviorism. I'm going to let you write that definition down here. Okay. All right. So John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner dismissed the idea of introspection and the idea of like our sensations and our feelings as being the, I guess, foundation of psychology. They rejected that, and they thought that instead of studying something that we can't even see, like feelings, we should be studying things that we can see. So they pushed to study observable behavior because you can measure it and you can record it, and there's actual evidence for everything that you're saying. They argued that you cannot observe a sensation, a feeling, or a thought, but you can observe and record people's behavior as they respond to different situations. They suggested that our behavior is influenced by learned associations, and this process was called conditioning. Now we're going to move into humanistic psychology. So, humanistic psychologists such as Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, they found that Freudian psychology and behaviorism were too limiting. Rather than focusing on the meaning of early childhood memories or the learning of conditioned responses, humanistic psychologists drew attention to the way that environmental influences can make and can nurture or limit our growth as human beings, and the importance of having our psychological needs met, such as love and acceptance. And this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And he believed that before you can become a self actualized human being, that is, a human being who feels full of purpose, having fulfilled their potential, and engaging in creative activities, they first need to have their lower needs met. That is, they need to have their psychological needs like food, warmth, rest, and then safety, like security, and like having a place to sleep. After that, the next social need that you need is belongingness and love. You need also self esteem and a sense of accomplishment. And all of that needs to happen before you can be self actualized. So, a lot of times, like the people who say like are the most successful people in the world, they seem that way because they seem to be self actualized and they have all their lower needs met. Now we move into cognitive neuroscience. The cognitive revolution refocused the mental process, refocused on how mental processes are embodied in the brain. Now, what that means is like how, and we talked about this in our last unit on cognition. How is memory stored in the brain? Well, it's stored in the neural connections between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Yes. So we specifically explore the way that we perceive and process information, and how the brain is supporting those operations, such as memory processing. But there's also many others, like how does vision work? How does motor coordination work? How does my brain move these fingers? And things like that. And I myself, Mr. Liu, studied this in college. And you need to write that down. All right, last slide. So after all that, we finally had arrived at a definition for psychology. And psychology, I want you to always keep in mind, is just like any other science really, is an ever evolving field. The thing with psychology though is it evolves a lot faster than other fields, and that's because humans are always changing. Think about how different this generation is compared to how your father and your mother or your grandparents, how their generation was. We have smartphones, we have computers that are in our pockets. How do you think that's changing us as humans? So the psychology field is changing extremely fast, but we can always use a scientific process to study human behavior. So psychology is, oh wait, let me just let you write the definition there. Science and behavior, the science of behavior and mental processes. So science, we follow the scientific process. Oh, sorry. Psychology is following the scientific process and studying behavior, which is anything a person does and actions we can observe, and how it relates to mental processes, which is internal subjective experience, sensations, perceptions, dreams, thoughts, beliefs, and feelings. All right, that is the end of my TED Talk. Please have a wonderful day, and don't forget to complete the consolidation activity at the end of the notes. Thank you. Oh, wait, let me show you my dog. Come here, come here. Come here. All right, come here. This is my dog. She was asleep. Say hi.